again, garden friends. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Jessica. I'm a master gardener through Purdue University Extension, and I'm in growing zone 6B in the Midwest. I am a suburban backyard gardener growing on about half an acre. So if you are a new gardener or a beginning level gardener or growing in a smaller space, or you just want to learn more about research-based gardening methods, then you may enjoy watching my channel. We have a little bit of a break in the temperature this week. Temps are in the 50s and 60s. I'm sure it won't last long. Springs in our season are very unpredictable, and we will probably get temps in the 30s and 40s again soon. It's also our rainy season, but I have a few days of good weather and I'm going to take full advantage. Over the next few days, I'm going to be finishing up some winter sowing, but mainly I'm going to be doing my late winter, early spring pruning of my berries, my roses, and the perennial plants in my pollinator garden. This is a great time of year to do that. I'm also going to be treating with some organic copper fungicide for some fungal issues on those berries that I had last year. And I'm also going to be amending the soil around those plants with some slow release organic fertilizer and some sulfur because my pH tends to run a little high and berries prefer more acidic. So I thought I would take you along over the next couple days and show you the projects I'm finishing up and also show you how I prune those plants. But first, a couple general pruning tips. The first is you always want to check your weather forecast. You don't want to prune within 48 hours of rain, and this is for a few reasons. When we're pruning, we're creating fresh wounds on a plant, and we want to give that plant time to heal itself. When rainfall occurs, splashback can occur from the soil, and so any soil-borne pathogens in that soil can splash back up onto those wounds. So if the plant hasn't had time to seal off that wound, we can introduce disease to our plants through that rainfall. We also know that wood is absorbent, so when moisture is drawn in on that fresh cut, if the temperatures then drop, we know that water expands when it freezes, so it can cause damage to the plant. 2, you always want to have sharp blades when you're pruning. Dull blades tend to crush more than they cut, and this can cause excess damage and a longer healing time. So whether you take your tools to be sharpened or you sharpen them yourself, make sure you're always starting with really sharp blades. I use a hand sharpener to sharpen my own tool, so I'll link that below if you're interested. 3rd is make sure you're using the correct tool for the size of the branch that you're pruning. Hand pruners are really only supposed to be used on branches or stems that are the width of a pencil or less. Lobbers can be used on branches that are roughly 2 to 3 inches in diameter. Anything bigger than that, you want to use a pruning saw or a chainsaw. Using the correct tool will not only prevent damage to your plants, but it will prevent damage to your tools as well. And 4th, if you're pruning any plants that had a known disease on them, you need to make sure you're disinfecting your blades before you prune another plant so you're not spreading that disease. If you're pruning a larger plant like a tree and there was infection in just a certain area of that tree, it's recommended to prune your blades between each cut. Okay, so now that you know some basics of pruning, let me show you how I prune individual plants, starting with blueberries. So here are my blueberries. I have 1 dwarf, 2 regular high bush varieties, and a rabbit eye on the very end. Pruning your blueberries is going to be really important to both the health and production of the plant. Now these first 2 I had in containers for the first several years that I had them, and I didn't do a ton of pruning because the growth was really slow. But once I put them in ground, the growth has really started to take off, so I'm definitely going to need to do some pruning. Now these 2 plants are probably about 5 or 6 years old. The back 2 are new for me, but they were probably 2 to 3 year old plants when I bought them. So I'm definitely going to treat these as that age. Now, if you are planting brand new blueberries, very small blueberry plants, this is going to seem counterintuitive and something you are going to feel like you don't want to do, but it's really important to make sure that that plant doesn't produce fruit in the first 2 years. And while this may seem difficult to actively prune those blossoms off, it's going to help your plant be a lot more productive in the future because it's going to put more energy into growing than it is into producing that small number of blueberries. So the first thing that you want to do on those 2 to 3 year old or younger plants is pinch off or prune off all of the fruit buds. The fruit buds are going to usually be on the terminal end of that branch, meaning the very end, and they're usually a lot more swollen and rounder than the leaf buds. So go ahead if you have a younger plant and prune or pinch all of those fruit buds off in the first few years, and then you'll thank yourself when they get big and mature and are a lot more productive. Next, we have some pruning that will apply to both both young and old blueberries. You're going to want to prune off any dead branches, and you can tell that they're dead because they're usually very, very dark or gray in color. They're very crunchy and non-pliable, and if you scratch gently into the side, you won't see any green underneath. It should just be brown. Next, you'll want to prune off any low, spindly, or weak-looking branches. When blueberry plants reach about 6 years of age or older, their fruit production will begin to decline. So we want to do something called a rejuvenation prune, and this is removing older branches, and it's kind of forcing that plant to send up new, young, and fresh shoots. But we don't want to remove too much, or it can cause too much stress on the plant. First, identify the older branches. These are going to usually be a lot thicker, a lot stiffer, and they'll have more of a bark-like appearance to them, whereas the younger shoots will be more pliable and more green in color. Then each year remove about 20% of those older canes, repeating each year until you have all new canes. Now on high bush varieties, you'll want to remove these canes at ground level. For rabbit eye varieties, remove them about 6 to 12 inches from the soil line. And last, if you have any new or vigorous canes shooting up above the crown of that plant, you want to prune them back about 4 to 6 inches. It's starting to get sunny and breezy, which is great for gardening, but not so great for filming. So I think the last project today is going to be pruning my fall raspberries. Now raspberries, blackberries, black raspberries are either going to be primocane fruiting or floricane fruiting. Primocanes are those new year canes that are coming up, and floricanes are those 2-year-old canes. Now fall bearing raspberries are usually primocane fruiting, which means they're going to bear fruit on those new canes that are coming up, which makes pruning really easy. All of these older canes that bore fruit last year, I'm just going to prune off at soil level. Back for round 2 today. It's beautifully sunny, but it's back down in the 30s and a little windy, so sorry if the eyes and the nose are running. The goal is to get all of the berries pruned, possibly my pollinator bed, if the weather and children cooperate. Always mother first. Sorry, I'm going to do quite a bit of squinting today. But first up, I have my black raspberries. These are summer bearing, and I would say pruning wise, these are most similar to trailing blackberries, meaning they're going to produce on those floricanes, those 2nd-year canes, and they're going to have these really long kind of lateral stems. First off, if you haven't already, you want to remove any of those old floricanes that produced fruit last year. I like to do this in the fall. It just kind of helps cut down on the risk of disease. So as soon as those canes are done bearing fruit, I will cut them off at ground level. So now all of these primocanes that came up last year, this year are going to bear fruit, so they're now the 2nd-year canes or the floricanes. During the growing season, when those primocanes reach about 3 to 4 feet tall, you want to tip that main stem coming up from the ground to about 2 to 3 feet, and that will force that plant to produce these really long lateral branches. And I'll usually just let those lateral branches go during that first year. Sometimes if they start to get really out of hand, I will tip prune them a little bit. But then I will, using ties, I will tie them to these lines, these support lines, so they're off the ground, and that way they're supported. If we get a heavy snow, they're not going to break. But today I'm going to prune those lateral branches back anywhere from about 12 to 24 feet. You want to prune back until that branch is about the width of a pencil. And this will help the plant conserve energy, and hopefully the plant will use that energy towards good fruit production and also producing new healthy primocanes. Quick note though, black raspberries have some really wicked thorns. I've already got myself pretty good today already, so be sure that you are wearing some really heavy-duty gloves when you're pruning them. And same as with the blueberries, we're going to prune off any diseased, dead, or damaged wood. We're also going to prune any of that low, weak growth. One new thing I'm doing this year is I'm using this tool. Now this is usually used for attaching plants to support. So for example, tomato vines to stakes. I can also use it to attach these long branches to these wire supports, but I'm also going to use it to identify my floricanes. So right now, when they're easy to identify, I will mark them with this tape, and then come fall, when it's time for me to prune these down after they've produced the fruit, I can easily find them at the base. Sometimes it's really difficult to tell the primocanes from the floricanes, especially when there's a lot of leaf growth and they put out a ton of new branches, so this will just make it a lot easier when I do my fall pruning. Another note is, and this goes with all of the berries that I'm pruning, we don't usually compost the branches that we prune from berry plants. They are very prone to diseases, especially fungal diseases if you live in a humid area like I do. And unless you can be 100% sure that they didn't have any sort of disease, I wouldn't risk composting them. They take a long time to break down as is, and so it's better just to prune them off and either burn them or put them in the plant waste pile or however you get rid of plant material rather than risk introducing more disease back into your garden. Now we're to my summer red raspberries, and these will bear on the floricanes just like the black raspberries and the blackberries. And these are pretty prolific. They will send up a lot of new canes. So we have a couple goals when we're pruning these. So again, if you haven't removed any of those old floricanes that bore fruit last year, go ahead and do that. I've already done that this past fall. And again, you want to remove any dead, damaged, or diseased canes. Next, I'm going to be thinning these in the hopes of increasing production and decreasing chance of things like disease. And so I'm going to be thinning to my strongest canes. I'm going to keep about 3 to 5 per foot. Another thing I look at is I have this water line running right here, and sometimes the canes will grow up above it a little bit and farther away from it. So I like to keep my canes as close to that water line as possible to ensure they're getting enough water. So I'll usually prune any that have grown farther out. Now my canes aren't too tall, but if you do have any canes that are really tall, you can prune those down to a height that makes it easier to harvest the fruit. And same as before, after pruning, I'm going to tag all of the canes so that I can easily identify them when it's time to remove them, and I'm going to dispose of all of those canes that I did prune. Back for round 3. Today I'm going to be pruning my blackberries, my pollinator garden, and hopefully my knockout roses. Starting with my blackberries, I have 3 different varieties. One is an erect, I have a semi-erect, and then a semi-trailing variety. And they're all going to be pruned in similar ways. But all of these varieties are floricane bearing varieties, which means they're going to bear fruit on those second year canes. Now again, if you haven't already, you want to remove any of those old floricanes that bore fruit last year. I already did this past fall. Another thing you want to do about midsummer for those new floricanes, so these were floricanes in summer of last year. When the erect and semi-erect varieties get about 3 to 4 feet tall, you want to clip the top, prune the top off of that main floricane stem. And what that's going to do is it's going to force some lateral branches, which is where you're going to get most of that fruit. For the semi-trailing and trailing varieties, I usually tip prune those midsummer at about 5 feet. I also like to, before winter hits, attach any of these lateral branches to the wire trellis system. This will help protect them and give them support and keep them off the ground, and also keep them from being damaged by heavy snow. So now it's time to do some early spring pruning, and there's a few things that I'm going to do. First, same as always, I'm going to prune any dead, diseased, or damaged canes. So for example, you can see this cane is very flat and has kind of almost a mutated split kind of growing pattern to it, so I'm going to prune off this cane. And like raspberries, blackberries are very vigorous, so I'm going to thin them. So I'm going to thin out any weak looking canes. I'm also going to thin out any that are growing kind of on the edges of this bed. Then I'm going to work on pruning the laterals. Usually I will prune off any lateral branches growing about 12 inches from the ground, because a lot of times the splashback from the soil is how we get disease onto these plants. So by pruning those off, I'm helping to prevent some of that disease transfer. Then I'm going to prune those lateral branches back to about 18 to 20 inches. And this seems a little counterproductive, especially because that's where the fruit is being produced. So it seems strange to prune off the branches that the fruit is going to be produced on, but this does a couple things. The first is most of the fruit production is within that first 12 to 24 inches anyway. And second, by pruning those laterals, I'm helping reduce the area that the plant has to send energy to, which will hopefully result in healthier and bigger fruit. And again, I'm going to tag those floricanes so that they're easy to identify when it comes time to prune them in the fall. Next is my pollinator garden, and with the exception of some climbing roses and some bulbs, these are all herbaceous perennials, which means they're going to send up new growth from the ground every year. You can kind of see right here on this sedum. So for the most part, I'm going to prune away all of this old growth. I do like to leave it up over the winter because a lot of beneficial insects will shelter inside of those dead stems. But here's a little tip that will benefit both you and early pollinators. So if you have any stems that are hollow or very, very sturdy, for example, I have some Shasta daisies and some hibiscus that are good examples, I always leave about 12 inches of those dead stems still standing. And the reason is these stems make perfect places for cavity nesting bees to lay eggs. And as the new growth emerges, it'll hide these dead stems. You won't even notice they're there, but that new growth will also help protect those eggs. And then next spring, these mason bees are often the earliest pollinators to emerge, and they are really important for pollinating things like early blooming fruit trees and berries. This video has taken me every bit of 2 weeks to film. We've just had such bad swings in temperature and weather, but I finally have a break today, and so I'm going to get the knockout roses pruned. So here is one of 4 knockout rose bushes that I have, and I usually prefer to prune them before they start to leaf out. The weather just wasn't cooperating this year. So normally I prune in one of 2 ways. I either do a hard prune about 12 to 18 inches from the soil line, and this seems very harsh, but it actually is recommended on the Knockout Rose website, and this helps the shrub keep about a 3 by 4 foot size each year. I also will sometimes just take the shrub down to about 1/3 of its total height, maybe even 1/2 if I don't feel like it needs a hard prune. But knockout roses can get pretty tall and scraggly if you don't prune them regularly. Now, I have been pruning them pretty heavy the last few years because I've had an issue with black spot, and that's been able to help me control that a little better. And the great thing about knockout roses is they are super hardy. It's really hard to do damage to these when pruning, but basically, again, I'm looking for those 3 Ds, any dead, damaged, or diseased branches. I'm also going to help create some airflow, so I will prune out any crossing or any branches that are too close to one another. And again, I'm taking that plant down about 1/3 to 1/2 of its total height. And then every 3 to 4 years, I'm going to take the entire plant down to 12 to 18 inches from the soil line. Pruning is done. Only took me about 2 weeks with this weather. But the last thing that I have to do is to fertilize my berry plants and also to use an organic fungicide on my berries and my roses. So let me show you the products that I like to use. The fertilizer I use on all of my berry plants is Berrytone. This is an organic granular fertilizer by Espoma. And the reason I like it is because it has a little bit of sulfur in it, which is going to be really good for those berry plants that like acidic soil. And for my blueberries, I'm going to use a little bit of extra sulfur. This is also by Espoma. Blueberries really want an acidic soil in that 4.5 to 5.5 range, and my naturally alkaline soil likes to hang out in the 7 to 7.5, which is too alkaline for blueberries to really thrive. So I usually have to amend with extra sulfur twice a year. Now, I do perform soil tests every few years because I don't want to over-acidify the soil, but that's probably not going to be the case for me. So that extra sulfur in my case is needed. But if you're growing blueberries, I really recommend doing a soil test at least every few years because it's such a specific crop that wants a very specific pH range. And in the early spring, I treat my berries and my roses with a liquid copper fungicide. This is an organic fungicide, and I usually just apply this in a pump sprayer. And again, you just kind of have to learn your microclimate and what issues are prevalent. So I know for me, we have very hot and humid summers, so fungal diseases are always an issue. So on my perennial plants where I can't actually pull them out of the ground like I would things in my vegetable garden, I proactively treat them with an organic fungicide because with fungal diseases, it's a lot easier to prevent them than it is to treat them after that disease is established. So my berries, my roses, my lilac, and if and when I get fruit trees, they will all be proactively treated with that copper fungicide in the early spring. Thank you so much for joining me on what feels like a journey of a video, for me at least, but I hope I was able to give you a few tips on pruning in late winter, early spring. Don't forget to check out my other social media channels where I post short, easy to follow video aimed at helping beginner gardeners, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.